Dancing is the great popular art of the black peoples, and the rhythms of Africa have long ago crossed the seas and become part of the history of music in the modern world. This is a Mandinka dance of West Africa, in which the spirit of the forest comes to condemn wrong behavior. At first sight, it may seem wild and primitive, but the dance is more complex than it looks. To the Mandinka, it has a religious meaning and a moral purpose. There are references to ritual, to myths and stories about the past. In a country where little was written down and stories are still often told in the form of myth and music, the dance itself is a living embodiment of Mandinka history. Many Africans today live in modern cities where the dominant influence seems to be European, not African. The old history and traditions are half forgotten beneath the cars and the concrete. Africa once had its own cities, its own civilizations, and now there's a growing awareness of the dignity and splendor of the past. But beyond the cities, in the empty solitudes, there seems at first to be no history to remember. Scientists are now agreed that human life first took shape in Africa, long before it evolved anywhere else on Earth. But development in those early days was extremely slow, and until a few thousand years ago, most of this huge continent, like most of the rest of the world, was almost empty of people. Before men learned to farm, the land could support only a few scattered groups of hunters. This is the story of African peoples over the centuries, of how they learned to develop the skills that enabled them to overcome huge difficulties imposed on them by their environment. The pioneering peoples who set out to master their continent long ago had to overcome tremendous obstacles. They had to survive in a climate and ecology of ferocious extremes. They had to fight off an army of killing fevers, pests, tropical diseases, man-eating beasts. And they had to learn how to farm under tropical conditions. Their mastering of their continent has to be seen, I think, as one of the decisive achievements of human history. I've chosen to visit three peoples, each with their own part in the story. These are the Dogon of Mali, whose art and whose dances keep their history alive for them. The people of Sukur in northeastern Nigeria still live in the stone-built villages of their ancestors and still follow a way of life which they've evolved for themselves through the centuries. The Pokot, a people of northern Kenya, have defied efforts to modernize their way of life. They've achieved their own balance with nature and are content with it. But long before these peoples learned how to master their continent, small groups such as the Khoi or Bushmen had made their own contribution. Until recently, they lived by hunting and gathering, just as the earliest human beings are known to have done. Khoi technology has remained essentially Stone Age, even though they now use iron-tipped arrows borrowed from their more advanced neighbors. The Khoi have devised complex arrow poisons made from a mixture of plant extracts and the toxic entrails of a species of beetle larva. Stone Age or not, their skill at tracking game has never been surpassed. The Twa peoples of the forests of Zaire, better known to us as pygmies, also lived a wandering life as hunters. This 50-year-old film records the ingenuity with which these so-called primitive people built a bridge across a river. First, a man was hoisted to treetop height at the end of a long rope of plaited vine. An enterprise like this called for a high degree of cooperation and planning in advance. Yet the Twa had no political organization as we understand it. Their population was small and their technology had not advanced beyond the Stone Age. Such bridges helped the Twa in their wandering life. Settled village communities became possible only with another major development. That major advance in the history of Africa began with the domestication of cattle 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. The population multiplied and the cattle herders spread far to the south. Some of them came to the great Rift Valley of East Africa, where they succeeded so well that their descendants, or people very like them, still occupy the area today. For much of the year, this is an arid wilderness of thorn scrub. Only for a few weeks during the rainy season, the thorn trees are green and lush. Many of the pastoral peoples who live here today can demonstrate for us some of the crucial advances which Africans have made in their history. The great move from food gathering to food production led to settled community life with all the social and political complexities which flowed from that. These developments are manifest in the history of the Pokot. A Pokot family homestead, like this one, at first sight looks hopelessly primitive and squalid, and its inhabitants just as wretchedly poor and ignorant. But anyone who has the patience to live alongside the Pokot, or a people with a comparable way of life, soon finds out that appearances can be misleading, even completely wrong. It's happened to me more than once in wandering about Africa's more remote corners. What the outsider sees as primitive and helpless can become, on better acquaintance, an astonishingly inventive and ingenious adaptation to nature and to nature's possible gifts. For these Pokot, the most fruitful of nature's gifts has been cattle. Over many centuries of gradual development, Africans have bred varieties of cattle able to flourish under tropical conditions. Cattle have become central to everyday life. From earliest infancy, children are trained to help look after them. A woman must be given cattle when she marries, and so must her father. Cattle represent what money has become for us, a measure of social standing, a credit rating, and essential to living. An important man like Lokoriongolol has 6 wives, which means that he must have many cattle, either in his dairy herd or in other herds nearby. The strategy behind this obsession with cattle is more sensible than it seems. It was essential for pastoral peoples to keep as many animals as possible so as to guard against drought or disaster. By integrating livestock with every aspect of their lives, the Pokot ensured their own survival. Each woman has rights over a number of animals, and she sees to it that her rights are respected. Only the children are allowed to trespass. But drinking from the udder is permitted only in the rainy season when milk is plentiful. Goats and camels can feed on the leaves of plants and shrubs which cattle won't touch. Camels were introduced to the East African Rift Valley from far in the north, so the Pokot had to breed and raise them under very different conditions. Instead of using camels for transport, as desert and northern peoples do, the Pokot have learned to rely on them for an addition to their supply of meat and milk. Boys belong to a group of companions of their own age. Such age groups, each with its own rights and duties, are a central part of Pokot social structure. The Pokot were entirely self-sufficient in the past and are largely so today. They buy little from outside their community because they can find or make the things they need from their own resources, especially from their livestock. A goat skin is pegged out to dry for the tanning process. A hide is scraped free of hair. Later it'll be softened with oil or fat and shaped for clothing. The essence of Pokot life, and this has been a general truth for most of Africa's peoples, lies in having developed and conserved a workable balance with nature, in knowing how nature, properly used, can fulfill the material needs of every day. It's a balance which highly industrialized countries are now beginning to realize that they must learn to recover. Everything here can have its use, even cow dung. Dung is useful as an insulating and weatherproofing material for walls and roofs, just as it used to be in Europe. These little huts are for sheltering young calves and kids from the heat of the day, and also for weaning them from their mothers. Women altogether govern domestic life. Though men like to command, women have a large area of authority and the self-respect which goes with that. A new byre being built is for a calf, which is this woman's property, although that's a European way of looking at it. The Pokot themselves don't have a word for ownership, because they consider life is not a matter of personal property. It's a matter of balanced rights and duties between each individual in the community. So women should do their work and men should do theirs, even if women, at least to an outsider's eyes, seem to do far more of it than men. The Pokot have had to acquire an intimate and detailed knowledge of their environment. The bush around their homes is not a wilderness. It's a kind of conservatory of useful products, fibres, herbs, medical remedies, everyday wants. If a woman like Chepochongil needs something apart from imported luxuries like her beads, she doesn't go out to shop. She walks into the bush and brings back what she's looking for. It's a skill and knowledge learned in the family by a long process of practical experiment and handed down from one generation to another. Outsiders may be ignorant of this knowledge, but it's not a secret. Anyone who asks can be taught. The bark of the desert rose which Chepochongil gathered has been pounded and mixed with water. The resultant infusion is a powerful insecticide. The women rub it on the young camels to rid them of ticks which carry disease, rather as modern farmers might use a sheep dip. Africa's peoples have had to invent their own ways of using natural resources. Skills like rolling twine from bark fibre are not as easy as they seem. And Pokot life really is like making twine. It looks simple, but it's the outcome of a complex development, social but also political. Here's a people who have no kings, no chiefs, no police force of their own, and really no officials of any kind. And yet they manage to get along perfectly well so long as nobody comes from outside to interfere with them or attack them. They have a government of their own, but it's hard to see it. It consists of a council of elders who safeguard and apply the unwritten but always remembered rules of Pokot community life. And these rules are respected because they're recognized to be necessary to community survival and the fruit of a long experience. These scattered peoples have learned to live with themselves and with nature, and inside the limits of the possibilities open to them, it seems to me that they've done it remarkably well.
Kukwa. Parasan bapi cho chang từ lúc nhỏ cả cái năm gì cho nó cái tất sen.
Only women can ensure the community's survival and its future. So although there are aspects of their lives which would enrage many modern feminists, they exercise far more power in the community than at first appears. A woman like Chemkea, the mother of the small child here, is quite capable of taking her own decisions and of making sure they're put into effect. Women can marry young, but men have to wait until they've gathered enough cattle to support a marriage. Only an elder like Lokariongolo can afford 6 wives.
Mali. Papa nyo no me ka yugi na po bata o panangka. Atarta mali. Wato papa nyo menempato panangka tarta pa mali. Kokoi. Inyo ni.
Iya kasi ne mate ka nyako riji. Manga nya susu. Me wa matara ka teja. Maka wangnya ka ete la pai ku wa kai ku te kai ku wa ku chiang su kam da no me pe ku ru ku kamal ko riji ya ju. Kamal ko riji ya ju. Ai ki su ka to ne ka to wet. Ku sun mu ka. Ku la lu a. Kram pa. Kram pa. Aku kwen dia ja ko puna ta ju no ko ta ino tin. Kil kwen ka chi ka so no ba ta. Ku ngo sun mu ko ne chi kro tu ti. Nga ta le put ka to a chi. Ku ka pai mo ne chi. Amba ko ku sa mu ke ni. Ku sa ka keret, ku sa ka keret, ku sa ka keret. Ne ke mu cha. Gonge to i ne. Mine. Mine gu. Aku na gu ngai ngai ta ta ta. Takal tua chi ba. Takal pat ku ku mal tua chi ba pe ku ga pe gule. Ku ga pe gule ta ya mu cha ba ku nguli cha ka chi. Akaruya.
Pokot life has its internal conflicts, but these people know their world and their place in it, what life is for, what life can give. And it's not a life without pleasure. Pokot society is one of many cattle-keeping African communities that's organized by age, so that a person goes through life in a community within a community, in a group of companions of about the same age. And this arrangement cuts across narrow family ties and binds Pokot society together. All the cattle peoples of Eastern Africa have very distinctive jump dances with strict choreographic rules, quite different from the whirling rhythms of Western Africa. Mostly of the young warrior age group, these men sing about their favorite cattle, but they also sing to invite the girls who slowly come to join them. One girl has just completed the initiation ceremonies that launch women into adulthood. She'll soon be married, and the dance is for her. Once again, nothing's as simple as it looks. Respected customs govern dancing. A son may not dance with his mother, nor a sister with her brother. The Pokot have a far more elaborate social etiquette than most Europeans. To them, civilization is not a matter of technological development, but of social responsibility. When the rhythm changes, so do the rules. Now the girls may choose a partner. African dancing has developed a ritual as well as social purpose. But there's also mundane work to be done. There's butter to be churned. Milking vessels have to be cleaned and sterilized with burning charcoal. At the end of the day, the cattle are driven slowly home. Pekot life looks, and in some ways it is, a rough outdoor existence, far from idyllic. Yet it offers a round of duties and pleasures, and these enclose people in the warmth of a psychological and material security. The Pekot have tamed their wilderness and learned how to live with it. They're not bent on replacing it with some other man-made environment. They see no need for change or improvement, even though change may be thrust upon them. They live much as dozens of other African peoples once lived before Europeans began to interfere. Miraculously, they've survived the intrusion of missionaries, conquerors, and colonizers, who could never bear to leave Africans as they found them, and tried instead to impose their own ideas of progress. What the Pekot have now may seem to provide little comfort and much hardship, but they're ready to remain content with it, leaving the outside world to its strange ways and destructive ambitions. While some peoples continued to rely on livestock for their support, others turned to mixed farming. This cultivation of crops for food was the next long step forward in the history of Africa. South of the Sahara Desert and its nearby grassland plains, food growing began to make progress about 2,500 years ago. This led to a further increase in population and the establishment of village communities through vast areas of the continent. But the expansion of food growing called for another technological breakthrough. Simple kinds of tool could be good enough for cattle-raising peoples. But when Africans embarked on tropical agriculture, which meant tree felling, clearing, hoeing, harvesting, they had to make more elaborate tools, and stronger ones as well. That need brought about Africa's interest in metals, but above all in iron. An extensive and increasingly skilled African use of iron spread rapidly throughout the continent. This terracotta head was made by the earliest iron-making culture so far known to have evolved south of the Sahara. The people and their culture are known by the name of the place where these relics of their skill were first discovered in a village called Nok in central Nigeria. Nok iron-making began in about 500 BC. Other Iron Age cultures soon appeared in the same wide region, and this metallurgical skill, probably of northern African origin, then spread right across the continent, reaching the Transvaal in what is now South Africa by about 400 AD. That's 1,500 years ago. These iron-making cultures developed regional differences, but the people of Sukur on the border of Nigeria and Cameroon can illustrate the vital importance of iron to community development. A man and his two wives go out to harvest their crop of guinea corn. Also known as sorghum, guinea corn is a valued food crop, and iron tools enormously helped in its cultivation. The farmer and his wives are working on a terrace of land literally carved from the hillside by the use of iron hoes. Iron knives and sickles sever the heads of the grain. All these tasks were much more laborious before the invention of iron. And having solved the problems of growing food where food had never been grown before, people like these were able to form permanent settlements. Gradually, their farmers could produce enough food to support craftsmen, such as blacksmiths, traders, and priests. And as their society became more complex, they began to feel the need for some kind of centralized government. Their priests became kings, small kings at first, but the kings accumulated power to themselves, whether to make war or to gain privilege. A king in Sukur had only small political power, secular power, but he drew added strength and prestige from his people's belief that their king spoke with the spiritual power of God. The king of Sukur had the power on behalf of his people to intercede with the one God who's above all the other gods in Sukur religion. He was believed to be able to persuade God to favor his people, send increase to their crops, and give fertility to their women. And God, when answering these requests, gave instructions to the king on how best his people should behave. Not surprisingly, God and the king seldom disagreed. Sukur economy consists of an intricate complex of productive activities. Just like the Pokot, people here developed a balance with nature, and this enabled them to profit from nature's gifts without undermining the ecology of the land on which they've depended for centuries and still depend today. Once a food surplus became possible, a section of the population could be released from the daily need to produce crops and could develop specialist crafts. In a division of labour, women could make pots and men could weave baskets. A sharper division of labour has also developed within Sukur society. Certain crafts have long been practiced by a particular group of men and women called the Nkyagu. In the old days, Nkyagu were not expected to do any farming. Instead, they could give all their working time to this or that special craft, making goods for sale or barter in exchange for food. Nowadays, the old customs have begun to disappear. In time, no doubt, corrugated iron will displace the woven roofs of the granaries. As the Sukur grew more prosperous and embarked on trade with their neighbours, their chiefs ordered the building of a stone roadway, more than 3 miles long, down to the valley below. And in a society as stable as this, with its regular food supply, specialization could extend beyond the practice of crafts into what we would call the professions. This man is a traditional doctor. A patient has been brought to him, suffering from a severely sprained ankle and quite unable to walk. With a combination of herbal remedies and a robust but carefully practiced manipulation, the healer will try to get the patient back on his feet again. Such treatment is really a form of physiotherapy, and no matter what the pain, the patient has faith in his doctor. And this element of faith has always played an important part in African medical treatment.
No.
The psychological dimension in African healing is now increasingly recognized by doctors throughout the world as a serious and valid aspect of curative medicine. But the decisive skill on which the whole of Sukur society depended was the smelting and smithing of iron. This is a traditional blast furnace, one of the last surviving examples of the process of metallurgy evolved in Africa more than 2,000 years ago. The rapid use of a double bellows forces a blast of air into the heart of the furnace. This blast, or forced draft, was necessary in order to reach the very high temperature required to smelt iron ore. Smelting is complete within about 2 hours of reaching the necessary temperature, and the furnace can be carefully opened. Water is thrown to quench the blazing charcoal. The core of molten iron is gradually revealed. At last it can be pulled out and plunged into water. Once cooled and broken into small bits, the product goes to a second stage in the foundry process, the blacksmith's forge. And this is where the professionals, the Nkyagu blacksmiths, begin their work. With repeated heating and hammering, the iron is pounded to remove impurities. The glowing lump is reduced to a bar of solid metal, a simple form of steel. Although it's slow and arduous, this technology was sufficient to meet old Africa's demand for metal tools. Perhaps more than any other, this was the inventive development, the key that enabled Africans to solve the problems of creating permanent villages. Behind this village technology lies an impressive record of metallurgical and artistic achievement. This magnificent bronze vessel was found in a royal grave of the Ezenri, an Igbo kingship of ancient Nigeria, and was the product of still earlier centuries of African skill and taste. Such vessels were for ceremony. They trace a traditional link between technology and ideas of spiritual power. Just as in old Europe, the craft of the smith was a mystery. It called for ritual. The blacksmith in Sukur had special skills which ordinary people didn't have. His work was seen as one of creative fertility, potentially dangerous by reason of his occult power. That power came from God, but it reached mankind by way of the ancestors whom God had chosen to build the world. So the chosen ancestors in African belief lead back always to the source of spiritual power, and that is why they merit high respect. This famous cliff called Bandiagara is the sacred burial ground of the Dogon, the final group of African people that I've chosen. They demonstrate one of the most pervasive themes in African history, the development of an elaborate system of religious belief. This is even reflected in the architecture of their villages. The Dogon settlements are clustered along the foot of the Bandiagara escarpment in a remote area of Mali in West Africa, not far south of the Niger River. The Dogon are another people who have their own solutions to the problems of an inhospitable environment. They cultivate millet, but specialize in growing onions, which they sell to their neighbors, as well as storing for themselves. Their farming requires a laborious process of irrigation. During the dry season, most of the year, water has to be stored in cisterns. Artificial terraces have had to be carved from the foot of the escarpment. And to irrigate this crop, relays of women have to act as a kind of human aqueduct. The labour is immense, but all over Africa, and not only among the Dogon, the drudgery of farming has always fallen to women. In common with other African peoples, the Dogon have evolved a complex system of beliefs about the creation and working of the world, and these beliefs are central to the ordering of their daily lives. Decorated with the four-armed cross of Amma, of God the Creator, a Dogon granary is conceived as a model of the universe. Door carvings depict the 8 original ancestors and other figures from Dogon religion, including those that refer to divination, the foretelling of the future by the fox, the agent of misfortune. Divination among the Dogon is the work of trained soothsayers. The diviners draw intersecting lines in the sand as a prelude to interpreting the tracks which a fox will make. The interpretation of the tracks has its own logic. Like Christians, the Dogon believe that God withdrew to heaven when man offended against his law, but the agent of evil in Dogon belief was not the serpent of the Garden of Eden, but the fox. Attracted by a bait of peanuts arranged in a particular pattern, the fox will predict the future with its footprints. The fox which brought misfortune can also foretell misfortune. Soon after dawn, the diviners come to see where the fox has walked in the night. By examining the tracks of its prints, they can learn the shape of things to come. They will have advice for individual applicants, or perhaps for the whole village. And if they're thought to be good soothsayers, clients will take their advice and will pay for it. But God's withdrawal to heaven brought to mankind more than misfortune. It also brought death. A procession comes down from a sacred cave where the spirit ancestors dwell. This will be the great Dogon dance called Dharma. It'll be a dance about death, but just as in the Bible, even more about life after death. Led by elders, the masquerade slowly descends to the village. Like other intensely religious peoples, the Dogon believe that death need be nothing final. Helped by the intercession of young men trained for the purpose, the spirits of the newly dead can join the community of the ancestors. Each group of dancers in the Dharma pageant represents some part of God's creation, both human and animal, good and evil. So the Dharma, again like all great dance festivals in traditional Africa, is also a celebration of this people's history, of their homage to distant ancestors who first mastered this mountain country and taught them, as they believe, how best to live in it. After the first big display, each small group does a set piece of its own. The stilt dances are thought to portray the long-legged water birds, cranes and herons, which inhabit the banks of the river where the first Dogon dwelt long ago. The tall mast, called many-storied house, has to bow to the 4 points of the compass before leaving the arena. The mask is carried upright in the dancer's teeth. Here, the Kanaga cross mask symbolizes the proud antelope of the Bandiagara country, the spirit of Dogon independence. In this great dance, as in some others of the same spectacular vigor, Africa evokes a time of reconciliation after the sorrow of death and celebrates a joyful promise for the future. Tomorrow the Dogon will return to hard reality, but the Dharma, in a world that might seem implacably hostile to a less devout people, has reaffirmed their beliefs and ideas. Above all, perhaps, that mankind should handle life as a gift from God, abusing it as little as human frailty will allow. As each of these peoples has revealed, in one or other aspect of their history, the African genius has known how to master a continent for human habitation and fulfillment.